is around those assessments. The formative assessments should be short and they should provide clear data snapshots into what kids are learning so that you will be able to know exactly what they need in order to provide those next steps for instruction. As a matter of fact, sometimes if we misuse formative assessments, we actually move into a remediation mode, which prevents us from accelerating learning. So now we're going to look at some tools for diagnosing unfinished learning. And for the term, we're going to use accelerated learning. When we think about the types of assessments and their purposes, we want to make sure that we stay focused on how to use those for students as well as for staff. Assessments should always support teachers in identifying how they can bring every student into grade level instruction. Assessments should never be used to prevent access to grade level instruction, and they should always connect knowledge to prerequisite skills in prior grades in order to link them. We should never use formative assessments as just our primary focus. And I want to be clear, we can use them to assess prior grades, but that should never be just our primary focus in order to accelerate learning. The purpose is for teachers to have precise information about what students can and cannot do, what they need to move on toward mastery. So by providing a strategic, just-in-time way of support, we can bring students into grade level content. Instead of using just-in-case data to inform decisions, we need to make sure that we provide just-in-time support. Assessments best support instruction when they're connected to high quality material and they're tailored to individual unique student needs. Students also, assessments provide students with opportunities to show what they know. Lastly, when we think about large scale assessments, even though they're valuable for system-wide information, they are less able to give teachers the instructional information that they need to support students at the unit and the lesson level. So let's now think about frequency of assessments. We look at assessments in 3 big buckets around frequency. That's daily, interim, and system level. And we're going to talk about the frequency in relationship to learning acceleration. So let's first look at system level assessments. System level assessments are often used to provide insight into information in student learning to help teachers support students moving into grade level instruction. Typically, school systems and networks use these tools to either screen or benchmark students in their learning. Those screeners and benchmarks are helpful, they have limitations. And frequently they don't include enough information for each item to get an accurate depiction of what students really know. And in addition to that, sometimes they're based on faulty assumptions of mastery, and they can also provide imprecise descriptions of what each item is actually measuring. So we need to be careful around system-wide assessments when we're using those to inform us of learning acceleration. We use formative assessments as the gatekeeper to keep the content that we're trying to focus on at hand. And we don't want to be counterproductive with the learning acceleration by overusing system-wide assessments. So now let's look closer at interim assessments. We talked about system level assessments. So we're going to dig into interim assessments and specifically progress monitoring. They are more helpful for day-to-day instruction and assessing. Progress monitoring is usually administered by grade as well as by content. At the classroom level, teachers may use these to provide insight into student learning. So look here at the examples that we see. We often see interim assessments in ELA, and math, of course. But we're going to look here specifically at this ELA example for K2. And we notice that for K2, often we see progress monitoring on foundational skills so that we will have insight as to whether students have the ability to decode and the development of their frequency of being able to read over time. We also see examples here of 312, and these are just pictorial examples that you see on the screen. So when we're thinking about interim assessments and daily monitoring, we want to think about those that are going to best suit us to ensure that we have accelerated opportunities for learning acceleration. We don't want to be data rich and action poor. We can move on. In order to not be data rich and action poor, we have to monitor our students on a daily basis. Teachers, leaders, and school teams can use data to determine instructional actions. Here are some examples of ways that happens. We see it at the classroom level, during PLCs and data meetings, and also observations. These are just ways that schools collect data daily in order to monitor student performance. So just pause here and enter into the chat box ways that you monitor student learning in your particular context. We want to see what trends we notice. So if you would be so kind in the chat box to just share with us, how do you monitor on a daily basis? Thank you, Maria, for getting us started. I see formative assessments, revisions in science on a daily basis. Doug shared exit tickets, Andrea exit tickets, rubrics, exit tickets. Awesome, these are great ways. Teacher observations and reading, assessment grids, observations. Awesome, so we begin to see trends around performance assessments with observations. We also saw quite a few exit tickets. I see some pre and post tests for the unit listed as well from Christine. Thank you all for sharing those. Let's now think about the roles of assessments, but we're thinking about it through the lens of learning acceleration. When we reflect on the types of assessments and the frequency of those, we want to emphasize to you how important it is to use those to determine the student outcomes and learning. Learning acceleration requires specific things that should happen, but there are also some things that should not happen. For example, assessments should give just-in-time information to help every student assess grade level learning. But assessments should not assess every previous grade level standard. So let's pause here and silent solo read our listing of shoulds and should nots for learning acceleration. And then chat out one that really stood out to you. Criteria for success checklist. I think that's one of the types of assessments. Build on student assets. Thank you, Anita, for getting us started. Access orientation. Thank you, Ms. Keeley. Generate a list of what they can do, just-in-time information, embedded within the curriculum. Absolutely. These are all things that should happen. Not a gatekeeper of grade level instruction. Great heads up there on things that should not happen. No grade level gatekeepers. Don't break the coherence. Absolutely. We should not. We should definitely avoid that if we want to be successful with learning acceleration. Now we're going to take some time and just reflect over our brief discussion of the types of assessments and the frequency of those. Right now, we're going to post the link to the roadmap in the chat box so that you will be able to access it if you haven't just yet. And once you access the link to the roadmap, if you'll turn to pages 10 and 11 in the roadmap, and once you're there, give me a I got it or a thumbs up so that I will know that you have reached pages 10 and 11 before I proceed further with instructions. Okay, so we're seeing people start to identify that they've made it to pages 10 and 11. So you're going to see those same three questions in the roadmap on pages 10 and 11, and you're going to have some private time to independently think and reflect on these three questions. For the sake of time, we're going to ask that you narrow down to just one, and we're going to take the next 3 minutes to give you some private think time to just jot down ideas from your reflection. Just choose one of the three questions and just jot down ideas reflecting on this using your roadmap. If at this time you would like to turn your cameras off and we'll come back, it is now 36 after the hour. We'll come back at 39 after the hour to give you some time to reflect on one of the three questions that you see. To join us again as we move on. We've been spending time focusing on assessments and specifically with the focus on what assessments and the frequency of assessments are best used to accelerate learning. So as you begin to think and plan to welcome students and teachers and families back to school, let's keep in mind a few things about assessments. Things that you want to be sure to consider: that you always use high quality instructional materials whenever possible. A great resource that you could tap into is Ed Reports. That's a company that vets materials, and they will be very helpful for you if there's ever a question about high quality materials that's being used. As you launch this next school year, you also want to be mindful of over assessing. And I saw in the chat box, someone shared fatigue from assessing, to make sure that we prioritize what we are assessing. Also, please remember that diagnosing everything is the same as diagnosing nothing. We don't want to be data rich and action poor. We have to be very careful of the data that we collect to make sure that it is usable, that is aligned to the curriculum, and it doesn't take away from instructional time. We should always use assessments that are formative and frequent when we're preparing for accelerating learning. We also want to be mindful to use those assessments that assess for learning, and remember that they don't need to be large, productive, long consuming times, but that they need to be short and precise, and that they provide us with the information that we need so that we will know what students can do and what they can't do yet, but are ready for. So now I would like for you to chat in the chat box any burning thoughts that you may have as we move on to our next phase. And if you're not ready to share, that's fine. If there are thoughts that happen to bubble up as we move throughout the presentation, please feel free to share those in the chat box. Thank you, Maria, always allowing not only teachers to reflect on data, but students as well. Assessment should not take a lot of time. Thank you. Now I'm going to pass it over to Bersha.
Thelma. So now we're going to move on to our second objective, which is explaining how teachers, school leaders, and district leaders will use information gleaned from assessments to accelerate student learning, and specifically considering what is culturally responsive and also this idea of just-in-time scaffolds. So let's focus on this question: what makes an effective just-in-time scaffold? Now, you've heard this several times throughout the session. You've also, I'm sure, seen it in the roadmap. And that's because a key feature of accelerated learning and getting students to grade level work when there might be gaps is scaffolding a lesson or a task. And that goes beyond figuring out just a lesson or two that can be used to review a concept. So today we're going to explore scaffolding more deeply. We're going to be looking at scaffolds that were developed using student data, and we're going to show scaffolds that address a variety of student needs. So every educator has probably heard of scaffolds, but there are some common misconceptions about what scaffolding is and what it's not. We know the definitions and expectations for scaffolding can vary widely. And so we want to take a little bit of time to calibrate and create a shared definition of what scaffolding is and what criteria make up an effective scaffold. So we saw this slide at the beginning of our session. We want to revisit it briefly. As teachers begin to plan scaffolds to address unfinished learning, some scaffolds may actually be remediation. So if the scaffolds are decreasing the academic rigor, or if the scaffolds make the task less of a challenge than the task given to other classmates, then they're actually not scaffolds. Those are remediation strategies. And a teacher may not even be aware that those are remediation strategies and not actually effective scaffolds. So again, understanding what scaffolds are and what they're not is important if we want to accelerate learning. So we want to show you an example here. So if we look at this example from what we would call an acceleration-minded teacher, we want to move from understanding content to diagnosing students using that prerequisite content as the base of the assessment. So a teacher giving an assessment may get some data back and use it to make whole group, small group, or individual adjustments to the year-long scope and sequence, to the unit, to the lesson level, depending on what the data shows. A teacher in a school could use that information to also match students with appropriate tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3 systems of support. And finally, a teacher would take action to support students to access grade level content that includes just-in-time instruction focused on some of their prerequisites. And you'll see here in this moving from diagnosing to aligning and adjusting, and then taking action. There may be some spaces where, let's say, there's a prerequisite, which is labeled A here, that may be needed for students, some students or all the students, in order to then move on to the grade level instruction that is represented by the Ds. So let's continue digging into scaffolding criteria. So what we want to really emphasize is that scaffolding is a verb and a noun. It's something that a teacher provides as well as something that a teacher does. Scaffolds can be different, and they can differ by student and they can differ by class. One thing that's important to consider is that scaffolds are temporary, and we really want to build students towards independence. We want to support them. We want to make sure that they are steadily moving towards grade level instruction. That means that we're not going to provide scaffolds for every assignment necessarily. That's what Thelma referred to earlier as just in case supports. We don't want to just provide scaffolds because we think all students will need them, and they shouldn't necessarily be applied for the entirety of the year. So if you think about a building that's supported by scaffolds, if the scaffolding is never removed, the building is not ever going to be stable. Scaffolds should help students engage in a grade level task, but they shouldn't be used forever. And so when we think about scaffolds, looking at this criteria, it's clear that scaffolds require some intentional thought and planning, and that they change how students will access the learning, but not what they will be learning. And scaffolds will provide some opportunities for access to students, but they shouldn't lower the rigor of a task. And so I'm going to give you a minute to just read through this slide, considering these do's and don'ts of a strong accelerated math instruction. A couple of things I want to lift up here. So some of these we've sort of talked about throughout the session already. The second to last piece on the right around providing a new experience, that may be a place where your teachers might need some support. For some teachers, and particularly in math, we might find that teachers have one way of teaching a particular skill. And so ensuring that when the scaffolds are provided, or if something is being retaught, that we're not just trying the same strategy again, but really innovating and considering what is it that students may need. And this last piece, consider the aspect of rigor called for in the standards. That's going to tell our teachers where they may need to provide scaffolding, what part of this task or what part of this text or what part of this math problem is going to be challenging for students based on rigor, and how might scaffolding support. So we've asked you to consider what work still needs to happen in your system for leaders and teachers to internalize the difference between scaffolding and remediating. So go ahead and independently reflect on that. Think about your school, again, remembering that the roadmap should be considered alongside the entry points for your school, the priorities for your school. So when you think about your school or your system, what work still needs to happen? And you can go ahead and capture those in your note catcher or chat in the Zoom. We will be linking the decks. Oh, thank you, Tabitha, for putting that in. So you can access a PDF of the deck. So as we continue considering scaffolds, we want to explicitly call out students who have been historically and systematically marginalized in schools. And to further demonstrate why we should be attending to these specific student groups in all conversations about instruction and acceleration, we're going to spend a few minutes digging into who these students are and how many of our students may fit into some of these categories. Considering specifically multilingual learners. So when we think about additional criteria for scaffolds, we want to make sure that scaffolds enable all students to work towards the same grade level learning objectives. And that is true for students with IEPs, that is true for your students who are multilingual learners. When we think about multilingual learners, we want to attend to the linguistic load so that our learners can really attend to the cognitive load that they're faced with. And scaffolds should align with IEP guidance. They shouldn't be removed or changed until an IEP team is consulted. So we have had some folks ask in previous sessions, well, what does accelerated learning mean for students' particular IEP goals or students' modifications? We always follow what's in the IEP and ensure that we are supporting students towards those goals. We also want to think about how to provide appropriate scaffolds so that students are not stuck and really get the opportunities to continually access grade level instruction. And we want to make sure that when we are providing these scaffolds, we're not stripping the difficulty. And that goes back to, we're changing how students may be accessing content, but we don't want to change what they're getting. All right, Thelma, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Okay, so now that we've looked at the characteristics and thinking about accelerated learning, we want to also take some time to explore a couple of case studies where the students that Bersha was just talking about are represented in those classes, and how teachers use data from different assessments about these particular students to provide just-in-time scaffold to bring the students into grade level instruction. So first, let's take a look at a case study from a math class. I want to pause for just a second and give you a minute to read this question that you see here to the left, the math question. And as you read it, I want you to think about what is required for students to know and do to have access and be able to solve this particular problem. So as you're thinking about it, I want to share with you some data from a sample class where a teacher actually used some just-in-time scaffolds to support students with varying learning differences. In this particular class, the student has 5 students who struggle with equivalent fractions on their just-in-time assessment. There were 2 students with IEPs that needed calculators, math charts, and manipulatives, and 4 students that were English language learners with varying levels. So the teacher had to think about how she was going to scaffold for these students. Just like any other students, the teacher in this profile had to consider several things. One, she had to think about, are all the legally required accommodations in place? For example, making sure that the students that needed a calculator had access to a calculator. Also, she had to think about what was difficult about this particular task for students and what supports they would need. For example, maybe they needed support with number sense or calculations. And then finally, she had to think about and consider the possible language barriers for her ELL students. Did they need support around vocabulary or sentence structure or passive voice? So as you're preparing to scaffold for students, it's very important that you take these 3 things into consideration at all times. Now we're going to look at an example of a scaffold that was used in this same class, and it's a visual scaffold that was provided for the students. Notice that the scaffold is color-coded so that it could help the student who had the difficulty with being able to find equivalent fractions. It would help them figure out what those equivalent fractions are. For the students with the IEP, she provided the visual chart, and they still have access to their calculators to help them figure out what's the equivalent of 2/3. Through this scaffold, the teacher was able to help them find common denominators. And though it helps there, it does not solve the problem for them. So in the chat box, share with us some possible other scaffolds that maybe a teacher could use to support students in this class. What would you think would be some great ones? Thank you. Fraction bars, absolutely. Are there any other suggestions? Possibly tape diagrams, visuals for EL students, fraction towers. Thank you all for sharing those. Attention to academic vocabulary, excellent. Those are great scaffolds that will definitely be necessary. Let's take a look at another way the teacher would scaffold for this same class. Because of the awareness of the ELL students, the teacher also provided this visual support and to help the students to provide access to language and to remove the language barriers that could be possible here. Notice that there is pictures there to help them for words that they may struggle with, such as gallon, or the fact that beehive and hive were used interchangeably. And even the idea of the verb yield, to yield honey. You see that there are visual cues here to help the students be able to access this problem and remove the barrier of language so that it wouldn't be difficult for them. Using such things help the students to clarify what the problem means without changing the difficulty of the problem. Now let's look at an example from an ELA class. In this particular class, it has a similar structure. This time there are 7 students who are reading below grade level, and they have difficulty accessing complex text. There are 2 students with dyslexia, and they have IEPs that require extended time, text reader technology, and text-to-speech support. And there are 4 ELL students with varying levels of ability here. So as we look at this, just like in the math class, there are things that the ELA teacher also has to think about and be very careful to support those students with learning and thinking differences. It's imperative that she makes sure that the required IEP accommodations are provided. She has to also think about the processing difficulties in the students with dyslexia, as well as those English language learners. These students will be reading an excerpt from Charlotte's Web, and a copy of the excerpt has been provided for you in the chat box if you would like to look at it and possibly use it at a later time. Now that we've looked at the things that she has to consider, let's look at examples. Here you see that the teacher is stripping away the barrier of text complexity. She's providing the students with visuals. For the student who has dyslexia, the teacher also provided the text on audio while the other students read the text silently. This allowed the students to still be able to engage in the analysis and the comprehension of the text and receive the appropriate scaffolds as called for by his IEP. The graphic organizer here was provided for the student with processing differences, which allowed for support of structure so that the student still would be able to analyze characterization and have appropriate evidence from the text to support their thoughts. These are just examples of scaffolds that are provided. What are some scaffolds that you have seen that work successful to support students with different learning and thinking differences in ELA? If you would share some of those in the chat box at this time, please. We see preaching of the skill, partner reading, buddy reading, modeling some of the skills in interactive reading, pre-teaching the vocabulary. These are all great center starters, all great ideas. Thank you all so much for sharing those. Discussion, color coding the text, excellent ideas for scaffolding so that students can still access grade level text. You should always make sure that the students are able to have opportunities to support them for grade level text. Someone mentioned providing visuals. So let's look at an example of an opportunity to access vocabulary visually. One strategy that works really well with supporting ELL students is to explicitly pre-teach key vocabulary that's assigned or aligned with a particular passage or text. In preparation for explicit vocabulary, even though that's great for all students, teachers have to pay close attention when they're working with their ELL students to ensure that they are making meaning of keywords that may be unfamiliar to them by providing those visual examples. Another scaffold is providing visuals for emerging ELL students as well. Sometimes these students lack the vocabulary from just day-to-day, everyday words. So having those tier 1 words in pictures as well as in the vocabulary with the definitions is very important. It's critical that teachers know the ELL levels of their students in order to identify and provide the most beneficial supports that allow the students to access and engage in meaningful text. It should be not just a one size fits all. Back to you, Versha.
Thank you. So now we're going to pivot back, knowing that this is a leader-focused session. We want to pivot back to the big picture and bring all this learning back into our own school communities. And think about how we can get ready for planning concrete steps and really plan for this coming school year. So using the self-assessment and the roadmap, we are going to give you a little bit of time to begin crafting or updating your assessment calendar that will help teachers bring students into grade level instruction. So we have the self-assessment that's aligned with a roadmap. And in this session, we're focused on priority 2. And what's essential to priority 2 is having this assessment calendar so that teachers are intentionally using assessments throughout the school year. For the sake of this activity, we would say, focus in on a particular grade level or a particular subject area. But keep in mind that while you're working, these assessments will be ongoing. So reflect on the data and consider how you're going to coach and teach and support teachers to gather data that will inform just-in-time supports. So just to be specific about what we're going to use our planning for time for right now, we'd like you to use the self-assessment and start planning out your assessment calendar for one grade or subject. Keep in mind the need for real-time data collection and the need for ongoing teacher support. There's a sample assessment calendar in your note catcher, so you can feel free to use that as a starting point. But if you are at the point in the summer where you've already started working in the assessment calendar, go ahead and pull up what you've been working on and how you can integrate today's learning into that assessment calendar. So we'll give you about 5 minutes to do some independent work and capture your learning. And we really encourage you, use this work because at 4:30, when this call is over, you are likely running off to do something else. So really use this work time to capture your reflections and specifically with the assessment calendar. If you have any questions, you can go ahead and put them in the chat. Otherwise, let's take 5 minutes. Let's come back at 4:08. And if you want for your work time, feel free to go off camera. All right, so let's come back together. Hopefully you're able to spend at least a little bit of time with your assessment calendar and start or continue sort of mapping out how to bring this learning into planning for assessments this year. Now, as leaders, we know that whenever we are implementing change, that can be overwhelming and disorienting, and we really need to do our best to plan for it. And while there's certainly ambiguity about going into this school year, we don't have all the answers about how logistics will work and all the operations pieces, certainly. We, in some ways, are in a better place than last summer. There's a little bit more that we know and can plan for. And so wanted to provide some structure for considering what does it take to implement a new system in a school? And what are the levers that you all have as leaders, whether you're implementing a change in a new system at the school level or at the district level, honestly, even at the state level, how might you use levers like these to overcome potential barriers to building a system? So for example, you might be leaving today and saying, okay, so one new system that our school is going to need is having a way to ensure that there are consistent formative assessments in all content areas and that teachers are using that data to plan for just-in-time scaffolds. So our first lever here is just establishing expectations. How will you ensure that everyone in your building understands those expectations, understands how frequently formative assessments should be given and how that data should be used and also how scaffolds should be planned for? How will you make sure that everyone understands those expectations? Then we want to think about tools and structures. There may be some tools and structures that are needed in order to implement a new system. For example, having a place to report out formative assessment data, or having structures in place for content area teachers to come together and analyze data. What will they need in order to meet these expectations? what kind of support might they need? So you may be in a place right now in which you're planning for summer PD for your teachers. So as you consider what we've learned today, and I'm sure some of you are already thinking about, well, what does this mean for my teachers? How do I turnkey some of this content for my teachers, and especially this understanding about appropriate scaffolding, expectations for formative assessments, what makes a good formative assessment, what support are they going to need? And that, just like students, that may not be the same support needed for every teacher in your school. You should also consider who is already sort of strong and has systems around some of these pieces and who might need some extra support. And then our lever that we never have enough of is time. So thinking about what time will your adults need in order to learn and refine whatever systems that you need to integrate this year. And how can you adjust time? Where is time? Where can we get back some time? Maybe it's by providing some content, PD content ahead of time so that teachers can watch something or read something and then come to PD and really be ready to engage. We also have all these sessions available recorded. So if you wanted to have teachers watch any of these sessions and asynchronously, we also are doing sessions in August that are specifically for teachers. So consider how you can also leverage these resources from TNTP and from DESE in order to maybe get back a little bit of time. So with that, we're going to move into breakout rooms again to have some discussion around these levers and consider which ones are the ones that you can really leverage in order to a new system this year that is aligned with diagnosing and effectively using scaffolds. So in a few seconds, you'll be moving into breakout groups and you can jump right into discussing how might you use these levers to implement new systems in your school this year. Back. Hopefully you had time to chat a little bit with some other folks who are working on similar things. We'd love to give an opportunity to hear you share out. We've talked a lot today about assessments. We've talked about a little bit about levers for change. So let's consider how we can sort of bring these things together. So if you're willing to share about either of these, you can go ahead and put a 1 or a 2 in the chat. Number 1 would be, what update or plan did you make regarding your assessment calendar? Number 2 would be, how will this help teachers and staff bring students to grade level instruction through ongoing assessments? So if you are feeling like you can share, please go ahead and put a 1 or a 2 in the chat, and I'd love to hear from some people. All right, Anita, can you kick us off, please?
Oh, sure. I was thinking that I think the way to make this manageable for folks, because we're coming off of a really difficult year, and is to help people see that we're really helping them to work smarter, not harder, right? We're taking the data and we're targeting our instruction to the needs of our class. And so then we can do less of other things. And this is a smarter way to do our work forward. And then the trick is going to be finding time for them to work together, to look at the assessments together, because I think that's going to be critical for sustainability.
Agreed. Thank you, Anita. I think work smarter, not harder is my favorite phrase ever. And I think your point about coming together, it's like, how do we keep ourselves from reinventing the wheel, or just maximize those who are teaching the same things and break down the silos? So I would even consider, like, maybe throughout the district, if there are schools that are using, if there's a common curriculum, let's say in your district, could teachers come together and really work on these assessment calendars and scaffolds together, so that they're not all doing it individually and they can really build something better. So thank you for sharing that, Anita. And I see in the chat, I just wanted to respond to Claudine, thinking about members of your team, definitely. And if you, again, take advantage of, if there are members of your team who haven't come to our session today, we are sharing the PDF of the slides, you're welcome to share that. We will be posting an asynchronous version, they could watch it. So really think about how you can bring this learning back, because certainly you're not going to do this work just by yourselves when you go back to your schools. Trina, would you mind sharing out with us?
Sure. Hi. Yes. So I was working on my assessment calendar right before this call. So that was really fortunate that I had a little time to think about that. And I definitely want to integrate, well, first and foremost, some of the language that was being used earlier in the presentation about the place of assessment and too much assessment leading to too much remediation and the pitfall of that. I definitely want to add some of that context that the goal of assessment is to accelerate, not remediate. And then also just the language around interim assessments and the timeframes and how valuable those are in conjunction with the sort of systems or benchmark assessments that we do a few times a year.
Thank you. Those are all just super helpful to hear kind of how different folks are thinking about this, and how we can sort of learn from each other. So thank you for those who shared. So let's come back to our objectives for today. And hopefully you're leaving sort of meeting your own personal objectives of what you wanted to get out of our session, and are feeling better equipped to kind of go into continuing to plan for the school year. And I want to leave you with this question of considering, what can we do proactively to support schools at every level, or to support your own school, to ensure that assessments and just-in-time scaffolds meet the needs of all students. And those are really learnings from today, because we can and must proactively plan our assessment cycle in support of teachers and students. And really that's to lead learning acceleration, and it's also to create equity. And so thank you for coming today. Just so you see where we are, this has been our third session that we're offering in this series. We have coming up next week, sessions 4 and 5. And then, as I shared earlier, our teacher sessions are in August. So please encourage your teachers to sign up if they feel like doing some work in August. And we will be providing them synchronous like this, and also asynchronous. So we're going to chat our survey for you, and please, you can see that we have more sessions coming up. And so really we do pour over this data every time and make adjustments to be supportive. So before you even get up from your computer, please make sure that you take a few minutes and give us some feedback. We really, really appreciate it, and we need it in order to make our sessions as good as they can be. So thank you in advance for that feedback. If you have any questions coming out of today, feel free to reach out to us and ask any questions you have. We will stay on for a few more minutes. So once you've done your survey, or when you are ready to go off and do your survey, you can feel free to log off. If you have some questions, we'll stay around, chat them, or just come off mute. Oh, I'm seeing the title of this session is not on the survey. Let's see. It might be called monitoring. That says there's something called monitoring, or anybody? Yeah, okay, yeah, so it's the monitoring one, sorry about that. Again, thank you so much for participating today. It was great to see some of you for multiple sessions now, or if this is your first time, thank you so much for joining us.